You've introduced then the concept too of fierce self-compassion, and so yeah, how does this? I guess is it different to a more tender kind of aspect of self-compassion? Is it really complementary there? Like what's brought that to mind for you, and what why is that important?
Yeah. So, well, Chris and I actually, maybe about 7 years ago, started realizing that there's this other face of self compassion that people aren't aware of. So, the self compassion is, let's say, take kindness, for instance. Kindness sometimes takes a tender form, it's kind of soft. But kindness can also take a brave form, like standing up for yourself, speaking up for yourself. These are also acts of self kindness. But people tend to associate self-compassion just with its tender form, which is more
Mm,
of a nurturing energy. It's about self-acceptance, and that's key to self-compassion. But taking action to protect yourself, stand up for yourself, motivate change. For instance, if you're doing a behavior that's not healthy, it's not compassionate to accept it. We accept ourselves, but the behavior we want to change. Or if you're in a situation that's not healthy, you're in a bad relationship, or if you're being underpaid at work, or any of those situations, we don't want to accept those. We want to try to change those out of an act of compassion. Sometimes that takes courage. And so
mm,
that's so when I thought about it more, I decided to call that fierce self-compassion. Again, borrowed from Buddhism. I mean, none of these ideas are new. So Thich Nhat Hanh, for instance, he was very active in the Vietnam War. He was
mm,
Vietnamese and
yes.
social justice movements. And so fierce compassion in the Buddhist tradition is the term that's often used for this action-oriented type of compassion.
Mm,
And I borrowed that term to talk about inner compassion that's fierce. That's I sometimes like to call it mama bear self-compassion. That kind of
yes.
it comes from love, but it can be strong, it can be powerful, it can be very agentic.
Mm,
And then I started getting very interested in how gender role socialization really interferes with the ability of people to balance both fierce and tender self compassion. And they need to be in balance. It's like yin and yang. Yin is more the tender energy, yang is more the fierce energy. These are universal human energies, and we need them. The reason we have that symbol is we need to have both in balance for good health. And yet, gender role socialization makes that very difficult. And again,
mm,
it's nothing to do with biological sex, or even if you're cisgendered or transgendered or non-binary. It's really just, how are you socialized? What are the norms for each gender in the larger culture? And for people raised as boys, and you probably have experienced this, it's not okay to be tender. It's not okay to be sensitive. You might get bullied or beaten up if you show too much sensitivity or tenderness, which means that's why if you go to one of my workshops, only about 15 to 20% people like you identify
yes.
as male, because it goes against gender role socialization, which is a tragedy because the research shows so clearly, this is a strength. It's like a superpower. When times are tough, whether you're in combat or hurricane or whatever, having your own support, having your own back is going to help you. But that's cut off for a lot of people raised as men, because it's not like a manly thing to do. So crazy. I mean, what's more manly, to be an inner ally or an inner enemy? I mean, you want to be an ally, to be strong, of course you do. For people raised as women, it's the opposite. Like, they're allowed to be tender, well, first of all, to others. They
Mm,
aren't supposed to assert their own needs, right? Because they're supposed to be self-sacrificing. So even though only 15% of the people that come to my workshops identify as male, women have slightly less self-compassion than males, because they feel less entitled to meet their own needs. So something's
mm,
going on there. And then the fierce form of self-compassion, speaking up for yourself, making waves, doing things like asking for a pay raise because you deserve it. Women are less likely to do that because they're socialized that, we don't like women who are bossy or too assertive or too aggressive or too ambitious or angry, God forbid. The research shows that people respect an angry male, they think, oh, wow, he's really passionate. This must be true. Whereas an angry female, they think, oh, she's crazy. She must not know what she's talking about. So that really cuts off women from this fierce energy that can be very important to, protect yourself or stand up for yourself.
Mm.
So, so I wrote my book, Fierce Self-Compassion. I really talk a lot about gender role socialization, and I wrote it during the Me Too movement, which I think we still are in the Me Too movement, but it's not getting as much press anymore. Just because of really people need to examine, how does our cultural socialization cut us off from these really essential human qualities that benefit everyone?
Oh, there's so much in what you've said there about this. It is inspiring to think about it. The first bit that stood out was the way we might need to be fiercely compassionate by setting boundaries with others, but also
Yes.
by setting boundaries with ourselves.
Yes.
It's that kind of energy and action, and sometimes that means going for that walk or getting our taxes done or, whatever it might be,
Or making
towards
a
ourselves.
change. Yeah. Or, stopping and going to get treatment, or
Mm.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, it's like the ideal parent. An ideal parent is not an indulgent parent,
Hmm.
because if you indulge your child, you're actually harming them. And so if you don't have that fierceness, sometimes to draw the boundary or say, no, you can't do that. But the thing is, it comes from love. Healthy
Hmm.
parenting always comes from love, including the boundaries, including the consequences for
Mm.
actions. If a child knows it comes from love, it lands very differently than when it's done as like a punishment, or when like the withdrawing of love is associated with those boundaries or those consequences. And the same thing with us. So
Mm.
punishing ourselves with self-criticism, or saying you're bad, or you shouldn't do that because you're bad, that's not healthy. But
Mm.
coming from a place of love, like, no, you need to go for the walk because I care about you and I want you to be healthy, not because it matters for how you look, but just because you're healthy and you're not feeling good in your body, and going for that walk will be an act of kindness. It just it lands a lot differently.
Yes, exactly. It doesn't self-compassion doesn't have to sort of literally feel good, maybe. I mean,
No, it
it's sort
doesn't
but
actually.
it's sort of good for you or something.
Yeah,
It's something like
it's
that.
about being, it's really about, we say it's about goodwill and not good feelings.
Yeah. And I
So
remember you saying too, perhaps at the MSC retreat, or I've heard you say that really it's more about in the service of health and well-being. That's kind of the direction.
exactly, right. Yeah. So
Mm.
sometimes the most pleasant thing is not the most healthy thing. And if we
Mm.
care about ourselves, we're going to choose long-term health
Mm.
over short-term pleasure.
Why can't snuggling up and eating ice cream and watching Netflix all day be healthy? But anyway, I suppose it's
But sometimes that's the thing. So we also like to say self-compassion is, what do I need? And
yes.
sometimes maybe that is what you need. And if you do it too much, maybe it's no longer what you need. And that's
Mm.
why the mindfulness, again, is so key. We need all these components, because the
Mm.
mindfulness gives us the clarity and the honesty and the authenticity to really ask,
Mm.
what do I truly need? And to be
Mm.
able to answer that question, we need to look at ourselves honestly. We need to be straight with ourselves. Like those friends who give it to you straight, but in a loving way, they're your good friends. The ones who kind of, oh no, it's not a problem, when it really is. They aren't actually that good a friend. They just don't want to deal with potentially hurting your feelings. And
Yes.
so being honest with ourselves about what's really going on, what we really need.
Mm.
And again, we can't do that without the mindfulness. It's
Hmm.
essential to
Hmm.
self-compassion.
And kind of wisdom, I guess, is in there,
And
just sort of
wisdom.
wisely knowing, kind of what I remember when I remember you saying, what do I also need right now? And I really appreciated the also word, because I would struggle with the notion that as a therapist, I needed to be compassionate towards others. And that was a bit
Uh,
of a block. And so, what do I also need right now? What would be really most helpful for me? That just meant that I could include myself, I guess, in the whole
yes,
circle of compassion.
right, exactly.
Mm. The other thing I was going to ask about, what you were saying with fierce compassion is, and the gender kind of notion. Does that mean that we sort of work with men in a fierce self-compassion way, or does it mean they really need more of the tender self-compassion sort of a thing, or is it really just both? Everyone, we try to get balance.
I mean, I think everyone needs both. It needs to be in balance, and there's so many doorways in. Um, so I really do think that for many men, the thing that's challenging for them is the tender self-compassion because of often their early childhood experiences. But so maybe the doorway in is the fierce self-compassion once they kind of realize, okay, it can be strong and fierce. And then maybe from the strength of the fierce self-compassion, they can feel more comfortable exploring more of those tender feelings as well.
Mm.
It's really just whatever works, and that's going to vary by individual. It's
Hmm.
interesting. Some people, like some BIPOC people in the States, people of color, have often said to me, we have to start with the fierce self-compassion because we're under such constant vigilance of threat, and have to watch out for ourselves, that it's not safe to be tender. So we can start with the fear, like standing up for ourselves. Okay, I know I'm going to protect myself. Okay, this is my part of compassion. And then once that the protection is there, that you have your own back, then you can feel safe enough to get some of the more tender, softer, accepting feelings.
Mm. Mm.
So it just depends on what your situation is and what's right for you. And that also may change over time and even
Mm.
moment to moment.